Hello BookTube, and welcome to my weekly reading vlog. Unfortunately, it's not been a great reading week for me. I actually, as I'm recording this, have not tallied up my numbers. I'm going to do that after I finish the video when I'm making the description for it. But not good. Maybe 50 pages, maybe a little bit more, spread out across 3 books, 4 kind of. I'll get into that in a moment. I'm feeling particularly self-conscious about this, more so than usual, because the previous video I did on this channel, the video I filmed and uploaded last night, was my bid to take part in the Has Steve Read It challenge. The Steve Donahue, a man who, according to his very own YouTube channel, read 29 books last week. So stacked up against that, 50 books seems pretty, 50 pages seems pretty inadequate. And in fact, makes you even wonder how we can both call ourselves booktubers with a straight face. And yet, that being said, if you're watching this channel, you probably know exactly the level of mediocrity that you've signed up for. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about the few pages I read this week and see if we can get any interesting points out of those. So, this week I've read The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. Not a lot, but I got a few pages read. Chomsky's Universal Grammar, an Introduction by V.J. Cook and Mark Newsom. And then this green book here is the Chronicles of Amber, the first 5 of them anyways, which contain 5 books in 1 volume. Now there's the Hand of Oberon, which I finished up last week, and the Courts of Chaos, which I'm starting this week. So let me talk about the Hand of Oberon first. As I mentioned last week, after I finish a book, but while I'm still preparing my review of it, I'll go back and reread the first few pages, or however long it takes me. So I did read about, or reread rather, 10 pages or so of The Hand of Oberon this week. But I'm not going to talk about it because I finished up The Hand of Oberon. I did a whole video review, a whole video dedicated to The Hand of Oberon, which I posted on the channel earlier this week. And now it's into the Courts of Chaos, in which I'm on to... How many pages did I get read? So it starts on page 645. I read to page 672. I believe that's right up to the beginning of the 3rd chapter. I don't think there's much I can talk about, really, because... I mean, I could try and recount the plot of the pages I read, but it really is... The story is so bizarre and convoluted at this point, and I mean that in an affectionate way, but it is, it's not going to make any sense unless you've read the first 4 books to try and talk about what's happening in the 5th book. So I'll just note that I'm enjoying it. Because this is a bit of a bigger volume, because it's 5 books in 1, and because it's falling apart a little bit here, I've got it taped back together here, I don't take this book into work with me. I leave it at home, and it's something I read while I'm eating dinner, or maybe try and catch little snippets of it in the evening. I read right up to a part in the beginning of chapter 3 where he's traveling through shadow. And then I thought, okay, I don't feel like dealing with that now. It's those traveling through shadow sections have been a complaint of mine throughout this series. So I've just left it sitting there, and I'll pick it up again tomorrow, I think, and try and work through that traveling through shadow section, because aside from the traveling through shadow sections, I am genuinely enjoying the book, and the plot twists are coming with that. Alright, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. Finished up the story of Sir Richard of Lee, which is a impoverished knight that Robin Hood helps to pay his debts. And then the new story here where Robin Hood and Little John dress up as beggars to go on adventures, which I've just barely started. Actually, Robin Hood is going to dress up as a beggar. Little John is going to dress up as a barefoot friar. Now, as I've been saying all along, this book is, at least according to Wikipedia, one of the first books about Robin Hood as such, not counting Ivanhoe. Before then, apparently all the stories about Robin Hood were ballads, but this was apparently one of the first attempts to make a book out of this that could be read by a modern audience, modern in 1883. So it's interesting to compare what Robin Hood was like in earlier form, possibly, to the Robin Hood we know of today. One of the things that I've mentioned before, which jumps out at you, and which struck me again in the pages I read this week, is how the emphasis is always on Robin Hood and his merry men having a merry time. So they do rob rich people, but it's not always with the sole purpose of giving to the poor. They were robbing the bishop in this case, and I think they were dividing his stuff into threes. So 1/3 for the poor, 1/3 for the merry men, and 1/3 to give back to the bishop. So they're taking at least as much of a cut as the poor. But what's more, you get the impression that they're not... The plight of the poor is not keeping them up at night. They're giving back to the poor as kind of all part of the fun. But the primary purpose of Robin Hood and his merry men is just to have a carefree life in the forest devoid of any responsibilities, which occasionally involves robbing the rich and occasionally involves giving some of that money to the poor. But yeah, just how the emphasis is just on having a good time throughout struck me as interesting. There's a character that Robin Hood meets in the chapter about Sir Richard of Lee, which is the Bishop of Hereford. Somebody from England can correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm sure. And the Bishop of Hereford was actually an antagonist in the previous chapter when Robin Hood was getting Elena Dale married to his one true love. So it's some carryover, some continuity of characters. I was on Wikipedia just now looking this up, the Bishop of Hereford, who was he in the Robin Hood legends? And it turns out that the Bishop of Hereford is not actually the name of a man. It's the position, much like the Sheriff of Nottingham. Obvious in retrospect, huh? But there was apparently a number of Robin Hood legends in which a bishop shows up in. So Howard Pyle has, I guess, taken some of those legends and made a Bishop of Hereford. It pops up in a couple places here, and then according to Wikipedia, he's going to pop up later in a different episode later in the book. So, you know, with the help of Wikipedia, and I'm relying primarily on Wikipedia for all my research here, it's interesting to see how the source material that Howard Pyle is using to create this book and how he's shaping the characters. Because, yeah, you know, when you watch a Robin Hood movie, you don't have the Bishop of Hereford often pop up as much as the Sheriff of Nottingham or Guy of Gisborne. Okay, I'm going to leave that aside and then go to Chomsky's Universal Grammar. Now, I only read a very few pages of this this week. How many pages? Like 4 pages. Page 115, 116, 117, and 118. Nonetheless, I'm probably going to be able to talk about this for a bit because just trying to trying to relate the concepts in this book or trying to talk about it myself, it always seems to cover a lot of ground in these videos, or take up a lot of time at least. Now, sorry, I'm turning the camera around because it might be interesting to look at this here. Language inputs. Talking about first language acquisition here. First couple pages of this go fairly simple. But then, page 117, I have a few questions here. But is this universal? Where's the evidence for this? And then page 119 is where I really start to lose the plot. I can't understand what's going on. This whole section is really confusing. How does this happen? I don't understand this example at all. What I don't understand are the comments I wrote in the margins. And then, how? This is rather early on in the book. But as we get more and more into the book, that's going to be a more common theme with my marginal comments. Is just a lot of comments about how I do not understand what is going on at all. This is my second time reading through the book. Sorry, excuse the camera. Second time reading through the book. I read it, finished it once, and I'm trying to reread it while I try and gather my thoughts for the review. But let's talk about what was in those 4 pages. It's good for me to try and articulate what I'm learning, or what I think I'm learning, and maybe it'll be interesting for somebody else. So they're talking about language input, the raw linguistic data that a child needs to hear in order to acquire language. And they talk about an early claim made by Chomsky. And the way they say early claim makes me think that Chomsky has abandoned this. Although they don't actually say in so many words that he's abandoned this. But they definitely give the impression that was part of the earlier part of the theory that maybe is not, Chomsky hasn't stood by. Which is the degeneracy of the data. Namely the fact that language acquisition is made more difficult by the fact that children hear so many mistakes, so many slips of the tongue. I'm a prime example of this myself. If you watch my videos, if you've been watching this video, you can see that I slip all over my words all the time. I mess up my sentences. I am a competent native speaker, more or less, but I make a lot of what is called performance mistakes in Chomskyan terms. Another good example of performance mistakes, again, comes from The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, which is a much easier version of Chomsky's universal grammar theories. He gives, I believe, the example of the Richard Nixon Watergate tapes. He says in his book that, because you know, when Richard Nixon was getting caught for Watergate, the papers got a hold of the tapes where all his conversations were recorded. And this being in the days of old media, before multimedia, the newspapers would just print the transcripts from different excerpts, you know, usually the incriminating excerpts of what Nixon and his aides were saying. And Steven Pinker was saying this, you know, this is one of the first times that the newspaper was printing extensive transcripts of what people were recorded saying on a conversation. And it confused people at the time because they were reading this and they were saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. When you try and read the transcripts of the Watergate recordings, it's a bunch of sentence fragments. It's the jump from idea to idea is not always clear. especially when you take away all the rhythm and intonation and stress away from spoken English. It can be really hard to decipher on the page. And people were just surprised in general by how ungrammatical the sentence fragments that Nixon and his aides were exchanging. But Steven Pinker said, but that's how people talk in real life. They're because of the pressures of real-time conversation, the act of having to think about what you're saying as you're saying it and form sentences in real time, it comes out with all sorts of mistakes in it. And that's what Chomsky is referring to as the degeneracy of the data. How could a child possibly learn language with so many mistakes in the spoken language that they hear? Now, interestingly, I don't remember if I had heard this term, the degeneracy of the data, before I read this book. But in my mind, I had lumped this in with the poverty of the stimulus argument. But they make a distinction here. They say that the poverty of the stimulus argument is separate. Poverty of the stimulus argument means that even if all the input the child heard was perfectly grammatically formed, the child still would not be able to acquire things like structural dependency or the movement based on the input. And I'm going to have to admit, I don't fully understand the poverty of the stimulus argument. I think the main thing it hinges on is that it doesn't contain any negative data, like it doesn't show the child what sentences are not permissible. But the degeneracy of the data is separate from that, although you can easily see it running alongside of it and supporting the same conclusion. Namely, the same conclusion is because the input is so inadequate, the child can't possibly learn language from the input, and therefore they must have some sort of genetic predisposition to learn the language. But interestingly enough, it turns out that the degeneracy of the data thesis was called into question in the 1970s when they did analysis of the speech that adults addressed to children, which showed that, on the contrary, such input was highly regular. Quoting from the book here, they found that only 1 out of 1,500 utterances addressed to children was ungrammatical. Such regularity, however, applies only to the language addressed directly to the child. So when the children overhear adults talking to each other, then that is going to contain all the usual degeneracy in performance data, with all the mistakes that a normal conversation would contain. But when an adult is talking to a child, they tend to, their input tends to be much more regular and well formed. Now, of course, if you were watching the video last week, when we were talking about the poverty of the stimulus argument, we were talking about uniformity as a criteria. So, in other words, if you're going to say that the children are learning language from adults speaking regular, well-formed sentences to them, you need to show that this is true of all adults across cultures, across socioeconomic boundaries, because all children learn language, not just children who grow up in middle-class houses, etc. And they do address that, I think, somewhere later in the page. Yes. Even if such fine-tuning or indeed any other adaptive linguistic behavior by the parent could teach the principles of UG, it would still have to meet the uniformity requirement that all parents use it, which seems unlikely. So there you go. But I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here. because talking about the tendency of adults to direct well-formed sentences to children, they talk about a guy named Brunner here, who postulates that there's a language acquisition support system, or LASS, Language Acquisition Support System, in the adult mind, which isn't really explained in satisfactory detail here, but it seems like what he's saying is that, okay, according to Chomsky theory, we postulate that a child has a language acquisition device embedded in their brain as part of their genetic heritage, you know, that they're just born with in their DNA, and this language acquisition device is able to take the language input that the child gets and turn it into universal grammar. And as long as we're postulating that, as long as we're saying, okay, well, that's all genetic, that's something you're born with, then why not postulate that adults have in their brain a genetic predisposition that they're born with in their DNA to direct well-formed sentences to children to aid with their language acquisition. But, you know, part of our parental or paternal or maternal instincts or something like that. It seems a little bit far-fetched to me, and I believe this isn't in this book, but I believe one of the criticisms that Chomsky's critics have of this whole thing is this is a lot of intricate information to be encoded in our DNA, which I think his critics are skeptical of whether the DNA encoding can actually do this. But I guess it makes as much sense as having a language acquisition device encoded in your brain. Yeah, and then the quote they give from the guy who thought of that, he said, "Language is not encountered willy-nilly by the child. It is shaped to make communicative interaction effective, fine-tuned." Now, I read somewhere, and I was trying to think where I read this. Maybe it was in this book somewhere, some part later in it, or it must have been in another book, because I remember reading this a couple years ago now, that according to some study they did, not only do adults speak in well-formed sentences when they're talking to infants or toddlers, but other children do it. So, you know, like a six-year-old child or a 10-year-old child, when they're talking to a 1-year-old baby, will also use what they call caregiver talk or baby talk. And now I'm assuming when they say baby talk in this way, they don't mean the mispronouncing all the words, you know, like, "Oh, aren't you a little cutie?" But because I can't imagine that would be helpful for acquisition at all. But I think it must mean just the well-formed utterances and not the chaos of normal conversation speak. So after talking about that, they shift gears a little bit to talk about how the child could acquire the various features of UG, what they call the binding principle, what they call the fact that English has a non-pro-drop language, which means English sentences require a subject. And then they talk about the structure of English sentences, which is subject, verb, object. And they give the example here of the dog bites the cat. Now what they say here is that, you know, in English, of course, we recognize this as the dog, subject, bites, verb, the cat, object. But for a child hearing this sentence, they have no way of knowing if the dog is the subject or if the dog is the object. I mean, it could There are some languages, and again, apparently these languages are rare, but they're out there, which, according again to Chomskyan theory, means if they're out there at all, anywhere, then that must be part of universal grammar, which are object, verb, subject order. So in other words, the dog bites the cat. The dog would actually be the object at the beginning of the sentence. So how is a child hearing this sentence in the input supposed to tell whether English is a subject, verb, object language or an object, verb, subject language? And the hypothesis is that it's done by what they call bracketing, which means that you would pause between the phrases. So the dog is the noun phrase, and bites the cat is the verb phrase. Now, if you're new to all this, like I was, you're thinking, well, bites the cat isn't a verb phrase. It's a verb followed by the object. But in Chomskyan linguistics, the verb phrase includes the object. I mean, there is another noun phrase inside the verb phrase, but the verb phrase includes like the whole predicate. So the subject, the dog, and then bites the cat is the verb phrase. And apparently, they've done studies on this, and they found that when adults are speaking to children, they pause slightly after the subject. So they'd say, the dog bites the cat, or something like that. I don't know exactly what the length of pause is, nor do they say in this book, but they call that bracketed input. And, sorry, I'm going to grab the camera around here. Yeah, they call that bracketed inputs. So the dog bites the cat. And the bracket here indicates the pausing intonation, where the boundaries of what is one phrase and what is the other phrase is made clear to the child. Now, as I'm reading this, I am again thinking to myself the point that's been made throughout all this book. But is that universal? Because by their own admission, the authors have made a big deal of saying anything that we postulate must be essential for language acquisition has to be universal. So you'd have to prove that all parents do this, or all caregivers do this, across all cultures, across all socioeconomic groups, across, So it's a little bit confusing to me that they just drop that in without clarifying whether it's universal. Maybe at this point in the book, it's just understood that everything has to be universal. So understood either that it must be universal, or understood that either this is pending more research to find out whether it's universal. I don't know. Okay, now I've only got a couple minutes before the camera shuts off on me. But from here, this is where I really start to not understand what the book is talking about. Let's see how much I can get through here. Much of Morgan's work is within the theory of learnability, a mathematical approach to language acquisition that has had a symbiotic connection to the UG theory. Sorry about the camera work. Formal learnability theory, starting with the work of Gold, 1967, is concerned with what is logically necessary for language learning. Wexler and Kulikover, 1980. Oh, yeah, by the way, point this out briefly, if it's not already obvious already. There's a whole lot more people, more linguists being cited here than Chomsky. So although the book is Chomsky's Universal Grammar, it's not all about Chomsky's theories itself. It's about the whole school of linguists that are working within the Chomskyan tradition. And you can see there's a whole lot of names being quoted here who are not Chomsky. Anyways, moving on. Wexler and Kulikover measured the input to the learner in degrees, going from 0 degree, no embedded clause, through degree 1. Now, why are we jumping to clause? We were talking about phrases earlier, right? The dog bites the cat. I don't understand the jump from phrase to clause. Okay, and that's my time, actually. The camera's going to shut itself